Hey witches, it's Lee and this is Do the Magical Thing. This is episode 3 of our series with Georgi Gardiner. And Georgi Gardiner, by now you all know, is a wonderful Associate Professor at Tulane University. And we've had some really interesting entanglements of conversations around sex magic, sexual ethics, of the solo kind. And now we're looking at group ethics. And this was a really interesting conversation for me, and one that made me go, oh, because what they are going to talk about is one of their papers, and you will have known we mentioned one of the other papers before, which was Sex Witchcraft. Sex is so great, it can improve the rest of your life, and philosophy can help, which I think is just an awesome title. And then this one we're going to talk about is really something that, like I say, it challenged me when I first thought about it. And then as I do whenever I feel activated or challenged, I was like, oh, let's learn more. And so the essay title this time is In Defense of Ritual Erotics Without Consent, Pagan Sex Ethics and the Costs of Knowing What is Coming. And I was like, whoa, hang on, let's learn more. So they basically, the preface of this, or the preface of this, is that Georgi assesses whether people performing ritualistic erotic acts at pagan ceremonies must have explicit affirmative consent from other attendees who are holding the space in the magic circle. They argue that if they're doing reasonable actions that are customary in the context, people do not always need explicit affirmative consent from other attendees, even for erotic acts. And I was like, whoa, okay, let's talk about this. Because for me, when you put critique and consent in the sentence, it makes you go a bit like, should we do that? Or how would we do that? But as you can see from that, that precis, really, it's a very specific scenario we're talking about. And we express throughout the video, and I'll just say it now, obviously consent is key. Consent is, in any kind of sexual encounter is key. And when it comes to a group ritual, I think, a bit of a, and this actually we talk about in the video, I think a bit of a kind of film rating model could be helpful, because in that respect, if you go to see an 18 movie, there are scenes that you might play out in that scenario. They might not happen, but they're likely to happen, or they can happen. There is space for that. There's room for that. And you'll know from previous videos we talked about containers as well. And so the film becomes a container. The ritual becomes a container. So yeah, if you obviously went to see a 12 movie, there would be stuff that you wouldn't want to see in there. And although you don't consent to every single scene, you have an idea of what is going to happen, right? Because otherwise, the movie becomes spoiled, essentially. So yeah, I think overall, having thought about our conversation, I think a yes and approach is good in terms of, yes, have a general kind of warning, like I say, the film kind of film category model. And, also maintain, the space for ritual theatre to occur. So, yeah, have a little deep dive into this conversation, and we'll get stuck in with a lot of deep magical theory. Thanks again to Georgi for their time with this. Frustratingly, YouTube is really bad at putting any content that has even philosophical discussions around sex out. So, so unfortunately, Patreon only for this one until things change. But yes, thank you, Georgi. Thank you, everyone who's watched through the first, second, third of these and saw the arc that has occurred there. I really would encourage you to check those out as well. And excited to get on with the Do the Magical Thing. Hey witches, it's Lee at Do the Magical Thing, and this is part 3 of our brilliant journey through sex, magic and sexual ethics with the wonderful Georgi Gardiner. Please do introduce yourself for the third time. 3 times, as they say, is the charm. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lee. So grateful again for this opportunity. So I'm Georgie Gardiner, and I'm on the faculty at Tulane University, which is in New Orleans, and home of many witches and much mysticism. And I'm on the faculty of philosophy and gender and sexuality studies. Interests are pretty broad. I teach creativity, and I especially focus on creative communities and how to organize events, especially countercultural events, events that sort of break the norms, this kind of container facilitation. And so for folks who have watched number 1, you'll know what I mean by container facilitation. And this, and sort of also the ethics of social sex spaces. So spaces that are erotic, but not like 2 people alone in a bedroom, but maybe more social, like, for example, a strip club, and like how to understand the ethics of those kinds of spaces. So BDSM dungeons and sex parties and so on. So I'm really interested in those kinds of themes. And this paper really brings a lot of that together, because it's going to be the sex ethics of event design, especially in social spaces that are countercultural pagan social spaces that have erotic elements. So it's really brings those themes together. So I'm going to start what will seem like a bit of a tangent, which is that I was a red man in Beltane in Edinburgh. So it's like, wait, what is that? Okay, so to back up a little bit, so Beltane is the traditional coming of summer. It's the spring. It's the last day of April, first day of May in a traditional Celtic pagan calendar, Gaelic, and it's a fertility festival and coming together of energies. And then 6 months later, you have Samhain, which was Christianized as Halloween, so 31st of October, and that's the coming of winter, and that's part of the 8 points in the wheel. And I was a red man in that. So in Beltane in Edinburgh's revival, so this is reviving this ancient Celtic festival, there was hundreds of performers, 10 to 15,000 attendees, all on Edinburgh's Carlton Hill, sort of all with our different roles, all with our different ritual symbolism. Um, and so that's kind of some background I have with Beltane. But also, even before that, I grew up in the English countryside, built a thatched cottage in the woods, a pretty like earthy kind of agrarian upbringing, growing our own food and so on. And then in this traditional English school in the English village, we would dance the around the maypole, for example, at Beltane. So it's always been a part of my life. There's a bit of, and it's always resonated with me as a kind of countryside girl. There's a
Yes, I
little bit of a
definitely hear
mismatch. Yeah,
that
yeah,
rurality, yeah. I know sometimes I say to
yeah.
people now, I'm like, as soon as I heard the word maypole, and I mentioned it, when we were talking just prior to recording it, and I was so pleased to hear someone mention about dancing around the maypole because I mention it now and people are like, what? And I don't know, I'm sure this must still exist, but obviously, but being again countryside upbringing and we practiced, it was an important thing that we practiced to get the ribbons right, and that was but thinking about it now, I'm like, well, that was really actually quite, archaic in some respects, but it's very kind of that classic English tradition in sort of the most best way, I think, in terms of those lovely, there's lots of Morris men who would be about. It was a whole thing with the Morris men sort of festival in the town. Um, so yeah, it's definitely those sort of things. I think we are, quite depending on who you are, the sort of urbanization of things has taken away some of that kind of connection to that sort of festival and festivities sort of thing. So it was such a joy to hear you mention that. That yeah,
No, totally. I feel like I've got to come back for we can talk about these things because my parents are really still deeply involved in the kind of
yes,
all the old, the ancient, like the revivals of the ancient,
mm.
countryside traditions, Cutty Wren and so on. They used to go to a lot of those things and folk music nights in the pub and so on. Those things never stopped. But yeah, yeah. Now, of course, there's this mismatch because I live in the subtropics, and so there's this. We're using this kind of Beltane and Samhain and winter solstice, and it's kind of like beautiful winter solstice. There'll be big, beautiful flowers out. So there's this mismatch between cultural background and then current climate, which is one of the things that many people have to navigate if they're part of these like en masse migrations. There's nothing wrong with en masse migrations, but you kind of see how Europeans have moved to somewhere like the Gulf Coast of America importing their traditions and they no longer fit. But that seems like a topic for another time because we're talking about suffix and consent in erotic ritual. So so to that theme, so I went to the Beltane in Mississippi last year, so just sort of 8 months ago or so. And it's called the Wildfire or Wild Hunt, and the organizer was very inspired by the Edinburgh Revival. It really took that to be one of the sort of key points that something that she was trying to recreate. But it was very different in structure. I can emphasize that. It was very different in structure. So in particular, the one I mentioned, the big one on Carlton Hill, kind of 10,000, 15,000 punters, as we would say in Britain, like
Fast, yeah.
audience members, hundreds of people. So, for example, no nudity because it's on Carlton Hill, it's a public place, although it was ticketed. Um, this one, it's in a private campground called the All You Need Institute, which is kind of eco education. It's an eco village. So there's about 40 of us, adults only. For the weekend, 3 days, we were having meals together, doing various kinds of rituals, campfires, talking, walking. I actually ran the maypole ritual there. Um, I don't recall any nudity, or I suppose when we were swimming in the lake, we probably were. I mean, that's just convenient. Um, but now the main ritual is what I want to talk about. It's known as the Great Rite, the main ritual of Beltane. And it represents sexual congress, because remember, Beltane is a fertility festival. It's the coming of summer, but it's a fertility festival. It's happening end of April. And the Great Rite is a symbolic representation of sexual congress. It can be interpreted, where fertility, it can be interpreted as creativity, for example, or abundance. Doesn't have to be like biological reproduction. And in fact, in the um, in the in the maypole ritual that I ran, it was explicitly about creativity and abundance rather than biological reproduction. So in the Great Rite, there's huge variety in how the sexual congress can be represented. So it can go anywhere from like something like a kiss or hand holding, or simply the sort of standing next to each other like bride and groom sort of thing, all the way to presumably sexual congress. I've never been in an event where that's the case, but I'm sure it happens. If nothing else, I'm sure it happens with two people alone in a bedroom having a ritual. I'm confident this occurs. Um, so in the Edinburgh one, the Green Man would dance frenetically, like exuberantly, to earn the attentions and the affections of the May Queen. So you have these two deities to back up. You have the masculine deity and the feminine deity. The Green Man, also known as the Oak King, and then the May Queen, the feminine. So the Green Man would dance with enthusiasm, and then the May Queen would then sort of choose him as the consort, select him, and they would then hold hands. Yes, that probably depended on the specific protagonists and what they chose earlier. Maybe they were hand-fasted. It depends what they chose to be their representation of sexual congress, hand-fasted, having their hands tied together ritualistically. Now, traditionally, the Oak King would be a man, the May Queen would be a woman, selected from the village, but pagan communities, they vary wildly. Are definitely not uniform in this respect, but they are very often avant-garde, liberal, feminist, LGBTQ inclusive. So they tend to be sort of more at the forefront of relatively close to the forefront of social change. I mean, it varies quite a bit. So in this particular instance, the one in Mississippi, both the protagonists were represented by women. They were chosen earlier that day and then briefed earlier that day about what the Great to Right would look like. So the May Queen was chosen randomly by lot. The Oak King was chosen by a certain kind of competition. They were then representing the May Queen and the Oak King, respectively, and masculine deity. And I say represent here, I mean that really broadly. So for some people, what they're going to mean there is during the ritual, then adorcism will occur. And they will be the spirits, the actual divine spirits of those two god figures will go into their body. So adorcism, technical term, the opposite of exorcism. The exorcism is you banish the unwanted spirits, you get them out, the ones you don't want. Adorcism is inviting in the spirits that you do want, the benevolent spirits. You could say that that's happening, that the two deities in like the humans have their human agency is kind of gone and their bodies have been taken over by those two deities, or instead you could say they're representing them ritualistically.
They're kind of
Or,
encloaked, would you say? Because that word adorcism, I mean, is it linked to adorn, as in to adorn something? I don't know how it's spelt, but
no, I don't think so. I think it's just if you take exorcism is like X is like out, and I
yeah,
think
and then
ad
add
is in,
is
so it's
add.
just that part. There's no N of
Yeah,
adorn.
I wonder if it does sort of because for me, I often feel like with when you're in a ritual or when you're in spell work, kind of regardless of it, if you're working with something, you can have that sort of outer offering too, or that kind of adorning of that particular property, energy, etc. That's really interesting. I'm obsessed with etymology, so I'll have a little look at that.
Same. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely. Yeah, they were adorned. They were fully dressed. This is relevant to They were fully dressed, and they also had long gossamer veils on, really big, significant, big veils and crowns. So fully dressed and with these big ritualistic veils. So they were only chosen early that afternoon, and then they were briefed. The rest of us, and then there was the organizer, the facilitator. I'm going to refer to those two, the Oak King and the May Queen, as protagonists. The rest of us, so the other sort of 37 of us roughly, were in a big circle in the woods, big magic circle. And in the middle of the magic circle was a ritualistic altar, just, a bench with flowers. All this stuff can seem really like scary or something, but it's like bench with flowers.
Yeah.
And then the organizer directed us through a ritual, which we all then kind of did together. So facing the east, facing the um, facing the west, facing the north, kind of these kind of things, maybe certain kind of breaths, certain kind of words. Beautiful ritual. And then the Oak King laid down on the altar, and then the May Queen sort of bestrode them in the cowgirl position. You see what I mean? So,
Yes.
I mean, they're both women, but women on top.
Yeah.
um, and then they gyrated slowly. And now the Oak King, the May Queen had a chalice, like a vessel or a bowl, representing the vulva. And the Oak King had a theme, ceremonial dagger.
Yeah.
Um, and they were sort of very, very gently, very subtly gyrating, really subtle hip gyrations. And then at the kind of climax, it was really beautiful. The dagger went into the chalice to represent sexual congress. Really beautiful. So I really want to emphasize it was really cool, really creative, really beautiful, really effective. And also, and this is really important to the ideas about that I'll be talking about, the sex ethics ideas, it was also aligned with custom.
Mm.
Really customary right, really canonical, kind of orthodox. It was very much a revival of long established traditions, very much aligned with the norms, very much within the norms.
Of
So
that,
somebody who
yeah.
sort of knows about Beltane wouldn't hear this and be like, whoa, they did what?
Yeah, yeah. It's the kind of this could happen. This is expected in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's going to be really important to what I'm going to say a bit about the sex ethics here, that it really was kind of part of what you'd expect. Um, so I commented to the Oak King afterwards, perhaps the next morning over breakfast. Thought it was really beautiful. And I commented on the subtlety and nuance of the gyrations, by which I really meant very understated, very small. And I just kind of commented there. And her reply was, oh, well, I felt like I couldn't thrust more because I didn't have the consent of everyone around. Okay. Now I'm like a philosopher of sex. So I was
Mm.
like, interesting, interesting thought. Um, and then I went home and wrote a paper about it because
Yeah.
the kind of friend I am.
Yeah.
Yeah, so because I'm really interested, like I mentioned at the beginning, about this like sex ethics for social sex and countercultural norms, and then all the ways that the mainstream can learn from mavericks and learn from the counterculture. Like the counterculture developed these new methods and ideas, and this really felt like this really juicy case study of exactly this when do we need consent to do things erotic in social to do erotic things in social spaces.
Mm. Yeah, that really does fascinate me in terms of like the idea. I think the key of it being sort of for me is I can see where the sort of thought bubble rocks up. It's because like this is a space where this is expected to happen, and there's been some kind of sense of restriction here that in different spaces, yeah, it makes sense, but in this particular space where it's an expected part of this particular thing, like there's that like I say, that sort of tension between activity and explicit permission. And you're saying in your paper there's nuances to be had really in these particular contexts.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So you bring up restriction. And this to me, absolutely. Like I am really pro freedom. Like I think that having restrictions is typically a cost. Not always. Sometimes restrictions actually enhance freedom or are valuable for other reasons. Having a restriction is a cost. And so if it's a restriction that we doesn't really apply, then we kind of want to like interrogate that and be like, well, wait, should I be feeling restricted by that? Um, in all kinds of ways. Recently, I was sort of like posting on Facebook about why don't people go out in their for their morning walks in bathrobes?
Yeah.
It's like I want to claim that freedom for myself. That's so much more convenient, much less laundry to do, and so on. It's so much easier. Um, so I think so. I want to emphasize that my friend was being commendably cautious, and I don't think she did
Mm.
anything wrong. Like
No, no.
morally, great. I don't think you can't go wrong by being too cautious about sex ethics.
Mm.
That said, and also, I do think that there's an error here, and it's at the error of feeling unduly restricted and unduly limited. They had more freedom than they realized, so they weren't using the freedom that they had. If they wanted to have fostered more vigorously, more enthusiastically, they could have done that. It would have been morally permissible. In that sense, there's a kind of opportunity cost, like they felt restricted in a way that they weren't. I think that we can trace this back to a particular error that's quite common, which is applying the affirmative consent model in a place it doesn't apply. So an overuse of the affirmative consent model, and I'm going to explain what that is, because of a dearth of other models that people can readily use.
Okay.
So these days, I'll explain more about this. When people are thinking of sex ethics, they tend to immediately think of the affirmative consent model, and then that becomes the be all and end all of thinking about sex ethics. And that's a problem because we need more models because sex ethics is more varied than that. There's more different contexts than the ones that are good, that are well suited to the affirmative consent model. So, what is the affirmative consent model? So it originated in BDSM communities, is where it really kind of became, kink communities is where it really became like solidified, discussed, made explicit, given acronyms, given explanations, and so on. And it's to govern scenes, kink scenes, especially in pickup play in things like BDSM dungeons. It is excellent for this. It's so
Yeah.
good for this. Gold star. So the affirmative consent model says you people beforehand, they say what's going to happen in some considerable detail. You outline what's going to happen, what isn't going to happen, what's beyond the pale. And then the people kind of explicitly, affirmatively, that's the affirmative part of affirmative consent. They say, yep, good, I consent to that. So tacit consent, like staying quiet, remaining in the space and not saying anything, does not qualify as consent under the affirmative consent model. That's the affirmative part. Tacit consent doesn't count. And the law is really explicit about that, where it requires affirmative consent.
Mm.
Be verbal, could be, or non-verbal. So you could be nodding your head, but it has to be some action, some explicit action. You can't just
Yeah.
passively stay quiet. That would not count as consent under this model. So we detail specific and informed, this foreknowledge about what's going to happen. So in sort of play party communities, sex party communities, people sometimes in the opening circles will say that includes STI status or whether you're intoxicated or your relationship status, what equipment could be used if it's like a BDSM dungeon. So this kind of detail specific informed information, that the idea is if you don't have that, you're not informed in detailed specific way, what are you consenting to? You can't consent if you don't know what it is you're consenting to. So something like if you get consent to kiss someone on the cheek, then you kiss them on the pectoral muscle. You didn't get consent for that. You got consent to kiss them on the cheek. That's the kind of detail specific element of that. Another element of this model, and it's not going to be as relevant for the paper that I'll be talking about today, the discussion we'll be having, is enthusiastic. That for it to count under the affirmative consent model, it has to be enthusiastic. And people have pushed back on that recently for two kinds of reasons. The sort of scholars push back because they say, look, you can consent without consenting enthusiastically. Sex workers consent even when they're not consenting enthusiastically. Some might be consenting enthusiastically, but like sex workers can consent and also just be like, because it's my job, I'm not that enthusiastic. Similarly, marital couples after decades, they can consent not enthusiastically in some cases. But also people might have, it's a more inclusive to leave out the enthusiastic, because some people might not be enthusiastic because, for example, they have energy depleting illnesses. They don't have a ton of energy. They find it hard to get enthusiastic about anything, maybe some kinds of mental health like depression and like nervous anxiety, or they're just not sure. It's something they've not tried before. They can still consent. They're just not enthusiastic because they don't really know what it's going to be like. But they'll try it. They're just not sure.
Mm.
But you can consent under those circumstances.
I see.
So
Yeah.
people have often replaced enthusiastic. Increasingly, people are replacing enthusiastic with an ambiguous. With the idea that's more like what should be doing the normative force, and it's more inclusive and
That's
ambiguous.
interesting. Yeah, that is interesting.
So,
It gives that sort of nuance there because it's a deeper term. Yeah, interesting. Okay.
hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's the affirmative consent model. Great for these BDSM contexts, also great for other contexts, various other contexts. Um, I sort of sometimes use it for like, can I share my students' work, for example, their classwork?
Yeah.
Great model,
Yeah.
often use photography. Can I take your photo? That's the affirmative consent model right there.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
It's also good for education as a harm prevention thing. So if you're like talking, a whole bunch of new freshmen or undergrads in your university, I can kind of see why people want to use that as a harm prevention. It's like, here is
Yeah.
if you do this, it's really hard to go wrong. So let's do this. So it really spread, and it spread from those college campus sexual conduct policies. It spread to all these other places. In some people argue that it should be governing any kind of touch, any kind of hugging, for example, all sorts, sort of any kind of um, participation in lots of different things. It's sort of spread all over the place. You see it all over the place. But it's also applied in these places where it really shouldn't apply. Like it just doesn't apply there. So in particular, all sex. And generally speaking, lay people love the affirmative consent model and they refer to it a lot and they advocate it a lot. And scholars, people who study sex ethics, don't like it and they criticize it all the time. And then there's this like little bit of a disconnect. And perhaps I think what we might later understand as a lag, where the lay people will at some point be like, oh, right, okay, now I see all the criticisms of this model. But it is an excellent harm prevention tool. So it's not like I'm
Yeah,
criticizing that it is
yeah.
widespread.
It's not saying you're not saying that affirmative consent is wrong. You're saying it's appropriate in its appropriate sort of scenarios, but there is nuance to be had about where it's most beneficial. And like you say, with the kind of that's so interesting about the enthusiastic thing, because I've seen that sort of mentioned more recently, and I thought that could only be really a positive. But it's so interesting, like you say, in terms of if you're working essentially as a service worker with the sex thing, when you're at work, you're not always enthusiastic about about work, and that's such an interesting one. And also from the disability aspect of it, of being like, yeah, all right, that's very interesting. And I think this is the thing with this kind of conversation, is there are layers and depths to it. And I think we have this sort of, by having this kind of conversation, we can explore that, ironically, in a quite safe way and in that sort of a safe environment that applies it. And I think it's interesting when you mentioned of kink and scenes and such like. I think that, affirmative consent is obviously incredibly helpful, but I think that depending on your role, and I'm speaking sort of more from a dominant perspective in this instance, there is an aspect of like a sub will want to consent sometimes beyond what so for example, if you're using kind of impact play or anything like that, it might be a point that as a dominant you might be like, okay, I can see that you've had enough here, but the sub might be still willing. And so you can have consent there that's affirmative, but actually if you're just relying on that, then you're missing out on cues from the body, cues from the what people are saying or aren't saying. And I think I think it's dangerous sometimes to use only affirmative consent. I think it's helpful to, because I think sometimes you go, oh, I've got the yes, I can switch off now. Well, no, you've actually got to be even more switched on in that environment, I think, personally.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. No, yeah, definitely. And a lot of scholars have been writing about exactly these kinds of things. So probably at least the most accessible, but I think probably one of the best texts on this is Quill Cookler's recent book, Sex Beyond Yes. And so this idea of like, look, you mentioned the enthusiastic thing. It's like, yeah, I can consent to you borrowing my car. I can be kind of like not enthusiastic about it. I'm a bit, that's a bit annoying. I hope you drive it carefully. Fill out the gas muffins. I could be unenthusiastic, but I can still consent. You're not like illicitly thieving my car when you borrow it for the just because I wasn't gung ho about you borrowing my car. Um, but yeah, so even just yesterday, I received an email in my inbox from advertising a talk by Professor Law at Law and Philosophy at KCL, Lise Woodard. She's referring to it as a moral consent. It's like so non-ideal that it's like a moral backstop. That really, ideally, in normal cases, we should be using fairly different norms, very different communication, very different normative models, trust, the kind of communicative norms, and that consent only kicks in if things have gone wrong. So here it's not just like, oh, we need consent and other things. It's like consent should only be morally relevant in the bad case, where all the other stuff, all the other like potential ideals and fail safes have gone, then it's the backstop. So that's one kind of example. And then Quill Cookler just mentioned, their view is like, it's just the wrong linguistic model. Why? Well, because consent has this asymmetry. I want to stroke your hair. So I ask, can I stroke your hair? And you're like, I allow you to stroke my hair. And this is like the wrong model because it's kind of like playing into this like man wants to insert penis into woman says, okay, you can. But then Quills is much more like, look, what about these other linguistic models we could use, like invitations, offerings? Would you like, these kinds of what would suit you? These other kind of conversational moves,
Oh, that's
communicative
interesting.
moves.
Like angles to it rather than one linear thing. But yeah, okay, interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And then another kind of point that a lot of these scholars will make is look in these long-term relationships. Remember that affirmative consent models, you have to know what you want to say, doing it beforehand, you talk about it beforehand and you consent beforehand. Like in long-term marriage, it's not really what happens at all. You're just kind of going with a certain kind of flow. So if it's morally permissible, it is, then something else is going on normatively. Something else is doing
Mm.
the normative work there. It's not affirmative consent model. And if we think it is, it's mistaken. And so another part of this picture is the consent model, which you've already actually described here. The consenting adults paradigm is look, consent is the primary moral feature, it's the load-bearing requirement. What does that mean? If it's bad, it's explained by consent. If it's good, it's explained by consent. If they're consenting, it's good. If they're not consenting, it's bad. End of story. We've said what we need to say. And so in that, another way to put that is that consent is necessary and sufficient for morally permissible sex. And then if something is assault or a violation or morally bad, in this kind of way with respect to violations. They have to explain it in consent terms. But there are problems with this because it causes a sort of shoehorning. So you have to say if you're working under this consent paradigm, this consenting adults paradigm, you have to say if the problem was that they were kind of drunk, is that they can't consent if they're drunk. If the problem is it's student teacher, is that they can't consent if they're a student. If the problem is that it's ship's captain and then underling, it's that underlings can't consent to a ship's captain. Well, actually, like my student could, I think, a 30-year-old PhD student can consent to sex with a professor. It doesn't make it okay. Like they have a
Mm.
30-year-old, they can consent. Um, it's still bad. It's bad for other reasons. It's like it's a terrible idea for all kinds of reasons, but like exploiting a power difference and so on.
Yeah.
Similarly, this idea that if the only tool in our toolkit is consent, we have to say that the underage people didn't consent. Well, but depending on which jurisdiction we're in, say 15-year-old, they can consent. It's not like some magic. They suddenly turn like on the day of their 16th birthday, suddenly they can do this thing they couldn't previously do of consent. They can consent. It's just bad for some other reason. It was
Mm.
underage. So that's the idea of like you can consent, but that it's still bad. I think you can also, this is more controversial, but I think you can have cases where you didn't get consent, but it's still okay for erotic kinds of activities. And so the kind of thing I have in mind here is like, suppose you've lived with your spouse for 10 years, you send them a photo of your boobs. You didn't get consent beforehand, but it's okay. They're not in every single case, but typically it's okay. You walk, they're sort of cooking in the kitchen and you slap the bottom. You didn't get consent beforehand, kind of ruin the moment if you did. But it's okay. It's like there's some other moral stuff going on in the background that makes
Yeah.
it okay. Think, and I have a draft on this. I've not written it up yet. To add another kind of argument to the pile of arguments that are mounting up by scholars against the overuse of the consent model, I think it can cause erroneous and misguided censure in a way that's inflammatory of relationships. So, what do I mean? If you think of consent as like the main model you're using or the only model you're using, this affirmative consent, and then somebody does something wrong, it's like if the only thing you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. But something like that. If your consent is your only paradigm, you're going to accuse people of non-consensual acts whenever you want to criticize them for an interpersonal misconduct. No, there was somebody in Knoxville who would go around accusing people of non-consensual acts when they sent messages, DMs, direct messages. So like in a Facebook group, and then somebody would send a big Facebook group, like a polyamory Facebook group, and somebody would send a DM, or just somebody sending a DM to somebody else they didn't know. And if for some reason it wasn't welcome, for some reason it wasn't liked, or some reason confusing, this person would go and accuse them of non-consensual acts. Now, it might be a kind of clumsy, it might be sort of putting their nose in where it's not welcome, like, I just saw you broke up with this person, I hope you're okay, or whatever. There might be all kinds of like bad stuff about it. Like a clumsy hug can be kind of awkward and social, like, whoa, that was weird. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was a non-consensual hug. There can be hugs that are non-consensual, it can be a non-consensual act. But some of these other kinds of social missteps are not best understood as calling them a non-consensual act, and doing so is kind of risks causing drama or like being unnecessarily inflammatory.
I see. And does that potentially then take away from the occasions where it is useful to use this model of sort of, yeah, okay, interesting. Right.
Right. Yeah, yeah, good. We want it to really mean something, like it really, the kind of significance. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because if all these different things can count as a non-consensual act, you're taking a photo of 30 people on a bridge, and so now you've taken non-consensual photographs of all these people, then suddenly doing a non-consensual act doesn't mean that much anymore. So we've kind of, yeah, diluted the what it means. We've diluted its normative power. So we have this disconnect between the public and the lay people on this question, and then the scholars of sex ethics. And there's two parts to the disconnect. Is consent an overused framework for the lack of other potential frameworks? And there's also, by consent, do we have to always mean affirmative, the affirmative consent model? Or can we have consent in a way that is not this like BDSM style? You say what you're going to do beforehand, and you explicitly say it's okay, and then you do it. So, in other words, can things like tacit consent, remaining silent, just staying in the area and not leaving, actually can count as consent in some contexts, for example? So, they're the two kind of points of disagreement where the lay people and the scholars are sort of coming apart on. And that's all the scholarly background to when my friend said to me at the end of the day after the ritual over breakfast, I would have liked something to the effect of, I didn't feel like I could have thrusted more enthusiastically, more vigorously because I didn't have consent for everyone in the circle. I did not launch into that like 15-minute lecture on the consent paradigm. Oh, I was thinking it. I was thinking it. Yeah, so that's kind of background. And then also in the background is in philosophy, my field, its background is either Judeo-Christian cultural assumptions or a kind of secular atheism with the Judeo-Christian cultural assumptions in the background. Basically, all the sex ethics that is ever discussed is this kind of two people alone in a bedroom model of sex ethics. Very little done with social sex, very little done with erotic contact that is not sex. So things like lap dancing and strip clubs and so on. Pretty much no philosophy papers about that in the sex ethic. And only fans cam girling type thing. Very limited context for sex ethics. So very little work on sex ethics for other religions and other cultures, almost nothing. And this is in analytic philosophy. But these are really important contexts. They're widespread, they're well established, they're philosophically fascinating because they raise all these distinctive questions and practices and insights, among other things, could then go back and feed our mainstream theorizing, like honing what we understand, what we mean by consent, or something like that, or what we mean by participation, or what we mean by audience, or whatever it is. So this is then I got home and wrote this paper. Well, actually, I got invited to contribute to a special issue on democracy in the bedroom. And then I was like, oh, okay, well, maybe I could write that paper, that idea that I had. And it's now forthcoming in Hypatia, which is a feminist philosophy journal. So I want to emphasize, so the arguments that I'm making, where my friend said I couldn't thrust more, I felt like I couldn't thrust more vigorously because I didn't have the consent from everyone in the magic circle or the participants gathered. I claim that consent isn't needed for her to thrust more vigorously. And it's not even desirable in some such cases. But I do want to emphasize that what I am talking about is the consent of the people, the consent of the observers, the people in the magic circle, the kind of, they're participants, but only in the sense that they're holding the space.
Mm.
I'm not talking about the protagonists.
Yeah.
So the people who are actually doing the thrusting, they would have much more demanding requirements, like something like consent or like very explicit communication. And the other 37 of us that were standing around in a big circle holding the space. And I also want to emphasize that I'm not making this claim that consent is not needed or not required, not desirable for every ritual. I'm just talking about some rituals.
Yeah, where there's that kind of expectation of some kind of, whether it's fertility, right? There's some kind of expectation of a relational dynamic within that. Yeah, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, like I think just for example, and we're gonna this is sort of slightly jumping ahead kind of thing, but just we just for example, like if somebody was in this is very culturally variable for sure. But if in my culture, if somebody was slaughtering a lamb in the circle, I feel like people would want a heads up and that they should give a heads up because that would be so abnormal. kind of thing. Whereas, yeah, that's presumably very much not the case in medieval times, where slaughtering or ancient times, you'd sort of expect a lamb to be slaughtered. It's an example.
Yeah, sort of cultural expectations.
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, so good. So this idea of like, well, consent isn't needed. Why isn't it needed? Well, so one way to get make progress on that question is, well, what is consent? Consent is is a kind of normative move that changes the normative landscape. It's makes something permissible that would otherwise be impermissible. And also called a philosopher called Hurd calls it the moral magic of consent. Moral magic of consent, meaning that in the secular metaphorical way. The moral magic in her paper. And the moral magic of consent is it turns something that would otherwise be impermissible into something permissible. So to go back to the car borrowing, um, if you took my car and started driving it around, it'd be impermissible. So my neighbor did it. I was driving around my car like today and tomorrow, took it for the weekend. Impermissible. But if I say she can, it's permissible. And that's consent. That's what consent is. It's a function of consent, but it's like the definition of consent. It's what consent does, is what consent is. It's the thing that does that. And that's the fundamental nature of consent. It's what it is. And that point can be lost or overlooked, partly because we use speech that sounds like consent speech. It's consent style speech to do all sorts of other things. We use it to signal um, concern for somebody, or to express respect, or to communicate delicately around a topic, or to signal our social virtues of being like really sensitive, like a certain kind of virtue signaling. Not in that. What do I mean? Well, suppose my friend turns up to my house for a little gathering. She's like on the verge of tears. She looks really sad. I know that she's going through a breakup. Say, oh, can I give you a hug?
Mm.
Here's my friend. I can actually give her. It's not impermissible for me to give her a hug when she's
Yeah.
on the brink of tears. I'm doing something else with it. I'm using the linguistically, it sounds like I'm asking for consent. I don't actually need consent. It's not really consent when she says, yeah, it's a different kind of communicative act. We're doing one of these other dances of like expressing concern, expressing respect,
Mm.
expressing that there's a kind of delicacy situation going on here. We're just enhancing our communication. I'm like checking in with her with my tone of voice. She's checking in with me back, communicating like, I really want to hug you. Like,
Mm.
I mean, if it was a stranger, then actually I probably would need consent. But like, if it's a stranger crying at a bus stop, would need consent to hug that
Yeah.
person. But if it's my
Yeah.
friend who's just coming from my house in tears, I don't actually need consent.
Mm.
Another kind of example is like now she's leaving home, she's leaving to go back to her house, driving back at 10 p.m. I say, oh, can I text you to check you got home okay?
Mm.
I do not need her consent to text her to check. Like you don't need text. You don't typically need consent to message somebody, partly because she's not obliged to reply, right? So it's like I can text pretty much anyone. I don't need their consent to text them. Hey, how you doing? They're just not obliged to reply. So that's another kind of example that can mask what consent actually is, because we're using consent like language to do these other things conversationally. So so what consent does is turn things that would have been impermissible into things that are permissible. So now we have the second question. Would it have been impermissible to thrust more vigorously on the altar on that day? Remember, they're fully clothed. It's not actually sex. They're fully clothed. It's a representation of sex using hips gyrating. So in institutional context, social institutional context, business, government, so on, hospitals, what's presumptively permissible is influenced in part by convention, norms, history, and widespread expectations. Where the conventions and the norms, the history influence the widespread expectations. Not that does not determine what is morally permissible. There's something like slavery could be normal and widespread and expected, does not make it morally permissible.
Mm.
Nonetheless, those things can influence what is permissible, where it's like there's a range of different things that could be permissible. It's like, well, the conventions, history, norms, and expectations kind of help to set what it is amongst the bigger parameters.
Mm.
And so in the context that of the wild hunt in Mississippi, we're on a private campground, it's adults only. The adults signed up and bought a ticket. The website describes how it's a pagan fertility festival revival. There's this kind of, we already know like all of these facts that it's a fertility festival. And in our culture, it's pretty normal for adult only retreats to have some adult themes, to sort of have things like potentially wouldn't be so weird to be naked, especially if it was something like a lake. Wouldn't be so weird to have these other kinds of things occur. Mm. So in those contexts, pretty plausibly, a more enthusiastic thrusting would be permissible. Then not everything, like we mentioned, not everything is presumptively permissible in this way. So bloodletting, for example, like real actual bloodletting, probably want a heads up because maybe it was like a Viking revival. I don't know. It's like not my
Yeah.
culture. I don't know. But like that seems like people would need consent to be in a magic circle where that was occurring. And so that's the kind of basic I that's the basic argument that it is not necessary. Now, there's still like a whole bunch of questions, and we could come back to those. But one of them is like, well, what about full coitus? Probably a lot of the people listening are like, well, what about if they had full coitus? Would then you need consent? That's a question that my colleague asked me when I was talking with them about this paper. What about sex? If they had sex? Like, the thing is, I think it's a great question. I find it I'm really a big fan of like realistic philosophy examples, like really thinking through realistic examples, not like by weird examples, because they can be misleading. I find it really hard to imagine that everything was the same, but actual sex occurred. Like it just feels like so far out of the Overton window of what would happen at these kinds of things. It just feels hard for me to like there was no briefing, there was no warning, there was no like this is what we're going to get up to. It just doesn't seem realistic. And to me, that suggests it wouldn't be permissible because there's no norm for that. That's just so out there. Now, if we were a closed coven, and to be
Mm.
honest, if we were a closed coven, we probably already would have talked about it. We probably already
Yeah.
know. We probably have years of like working up towards that kind of thing. So gradually increasing the Overton window of what might happen and gradually sort of but I think it probably just would not be permissible. And that some of the evidence for that is like I can't even imagine. I mean, I haven't been to that many things, but like I just it seems really out there in a way that I think would be like normal enough that that would not be permissible.
Yeah, I think in a kind of ritual that is open to people wider than a closed coven, obviously it depends on how it is put out there. But again, this speaks to the point of it being a particular container that you choose to open up and sort of dig around in or exist in for a while, and also the fact that as an adult you can choose to disengage. You can choose if and that's even if you have gone, this sounds pretty good, but then you're part way through and you're like, actually not for me. And I think that's an interesting thing. And I think really communication is something that is as important to pagans and Wiccans and any other sort of magical practitioner engaging in this, any kind of sex magic. Is communication still exists. It doesn't just magically disappear because you get your wand down. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's
Totally.
that's
Totally.
still a
No,
thing.
totally. It was like one of the referees was like, "Well, can you talk about what would happen if there was a kind of misstep?" And I just sort of thought they would talk about it, just like in every other community, just like they would at a chess club. People would talk about it.
Yeah.
People would like think about it, talk about it. Yeah, it's like I think that in general, pagan communities are just like a lot more, in most ways, a lot more normal, a lot more just ordinary,
Yeah, and I think
gatherings.
that word normal is such an interesting thing because I think what happens is, especially when you encounter and speak to folk kind of outside of it, and even people inside of it who inside of paganism or witchcraft or any kind of occult community, that there's a lot of variance in practices, and some people would be totally up for a rite that was something that was fully explicit, for want of a better term, versus people who would want rather the symbolic aspect of that, versus some people who just wouldn't be their thing at all. And I think what paganism often provides is an alternative space, and that in then you have to ask yourself, like, alternative to what? And the alternative to what is that we have a society where we have so many things just about being naked, even without a sexual component. There's such a thing about that, and it's so interesting because there are norms that can occur in different countries. For instance, my grandmother had a Swedish guest staying, and she happened to just pop the bin out the door. I think it was. I think she was topless because it didn't really make any. It wasn't necessarily a thing that was a cultural norm to be like, I should be, fully clothed for this particular activity, and 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 what was ironic is that the neighbour happened to see and was like, "Whoa, okay, this is a bit of a thing," and they were like. In that typical kind of thing of like, well, I wasn't expecting to see it, but I'm not exactly complaining. Like it's that thing of we have these sort of ideas around and taboos that occur in this kind of really this Christian culture that hangs over and is still within us as much as we may see declining numbers in churches and such like, depending on where you are. There is still this sense of like propriety and what is proper, and we've got to kind of ask ourselves: is are those senses of propriety still helpful? Were they ever helpful actually, and were they actually perhaps more negative in terms of, especially in terms of our bodies and being able to and we see this a lot in terms of things of just even something simple like breastfeeding, like women being told they're being disgusting for feeding their child because they've got their breasts exposed. It's kind of it's such an interesting thing to me in that we have demonized, I think that's the correct term to use here, but we've demonized this sense of, of a certain freedoms when they don't, impinge on others in the ways that perhaps we think they might do. And I think that's what made me interested when I was looking at the Edinburgh Festival, and it talked about, children are welcome, but you've got to be aware there's going to be sort of uninhibited behaviour. You've got to judge, it's your child, you've got to think about that. And I thought the word uninhibited was so interesting because it makes you question then how much are we restraining ourselves in certain ways, however we might define uninhibited. And I think it would be helpful to sort of define that perhaps a little bit more so, but maybe like with this conversation around consent, actually the defining it even far more finitely takes away from the freedom within the word uninhibited in terms of what does that mean and what can that encapsulate. It's just, yeah, it's such a lot of I find this fascinating because it is that thing of we have the immediate reactions to the idea of criticizing norms, whether that is and whether that's useful norms, like you say, the affirmative consent model can be useful and is useful in particular things. But when we have, like you say, this and use the term sort of layperson, I think that kind of that it's almost like the sort of meme version of understanding in terms of it's quite short and it's that sort of it's something that you're reading the first paragraph of something that is pages long and actually maybe need to sort of dig a little bit deeper into, okay, this is a great application here, but also just the time to think. And that, that sort of makes me think of just how frustrating it is that we have such limited time to be able to wrestle with these things because we have to sort of keep making capital existing within this sort of system, whereas we're not having, and perhaps that's why we see slow progress in certain things, because we don't have this space to really kind of explore these ideas as a society outside of institutions which are difficult to access for people like, the working class or otherwise.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that these are kind of philosophy shortcuts, but they're not short to learn. They take a long time to learn, and then you can use them. So you can cut through you can see certain things that might be invisible to other people. So, for example, in this case, what's happening is something was really, really successful in one or two contexts or more contexts, and then it gets overused in other ones. And so then when you see that pattern, you can see it arise for other things, like arguably the pride, the idea of pride. So you have like Black pride, super important, super valuable. Gay pride, great. Like took the same idea, applied it, brilliant. And now you have like proud mother in this country, proud mother of a Chicago University graduate. I'm a proud blah blah blah. I'm a proud. Do you see this like something a discourse that was really successful is now really overused? I'm proud of this, proud of that. It's like pride is kind of a little bit of can we use a different like that's classically understood as a vice? Could we use some other thing?
Mm.
But I want to talk a little bit. So I've talked about why I think consent isn't necessary, but I have a stronger claims, which is that it's not desirable and not feasible as well. So I can talk about those. Um, yeah, like I say, so it's not necessary. Now it would. And then I mentioned like, oh, I couldn't really full coitus would be abnormal. And another thing is that gyrating, like we've kind of intimated, it would be abnormal if it was, say, for example, just in a state park. where maybe there's a ticket is only the event is only 3 hours long and the ticket is only $1 to go in. So it's much more casual and there's stalls and so on, sort of pagan pride festival. Actually, that's what our local thing to speak of pride. Our local festival is called Pagan Pride. If it was gyrating on an altar there, that would be like, you're not meant
Mm.
to do that. This is just a sort of
A
day
gathering
festival,
spot,
but it
yeah.
was like a multi-day in a private campground. People driving an hour and a half to get to. Most people were. But I want to talk about why it's not consent is not desirable, which is a bolder claim. Um,
Mm.
or at least not desirable in at least some contexts. So recall that for this affirmative consent model, for just focusing on the affirmative consent model for now, um, you need detail specific foreknowledge. Because otherwise, what were you even consenting to? If you're just like, oh, I consent to there being some ritual or other, I don't know what it's going to be, then consent can't really do that much heavy lifting. It's not a load bearing thing there. You don't even know what you're consenting to. It's just really vague. So it has to be, for consent, the affirmative consent model to do work, it has to be specific, detail oriented foreknowledge that you then consent to. But knowledge can carry costs. There's advantages to having ignorance sometimes. And in particular, in this case, having foreknowledge of a ritual can undermine the functions and aims and values of the ritual. So here are some examples. The one thing that some rituals aim to do, rituals are very varied, which is why we need a varied different ethical models for the different functions and aims and types of ritual. So one thing is like transmitting arcane knowledge. So sometimes you have a ritual can convey or create sacred or profane knowledge that outsiders don't have. So maybe the initiates of the magic circle learning access to that special sacred knowledge by going through a kind of ritual of ordeal, proving their worthiness, proving their dedication. Or it might be that the ritual itself transmits the secret knowledge. So the symbols are the knowledge. So it could be that like the people who are in the stone cutters simply are the people that know what happened in the stone cutters initiation ritual. The ritual, the secrets that the knowledge of the ritual is the secret knowledge. Because now you've done the ritual, you know what happens. Now you're a stone cutter
Mm.
in virtue of knowing what it is through going through the ritual. Some rituals aim to create secret knowledge. So the Oxford Billingtons Club, it's kind of rich people misbehaving, trashing hotel rooms. It's not actually affiliated with Oxford University, but the undergrad, not officially, the undergrads would the Oxford undergrads. Apparently, what they would do is ensure it initiates loyalty by putting them through ordeals. It would be embarrassing if those secrets ever got out. And so they would do things that were it to ever get out, those initiates would be embarrassed, and that would ensure loyalty to everybody else in the group. I've actually heard that Margaret Thatcher would deliberately hire people and promote people that she knew their secrets, that had these dark secrets of the Billington Club variety, so that she had
Mm.
leverage over them. So in that case, you have the ritual. You can't say what's going to happen in the ritual beforehand because the whole point is it's a secret, and the function of the ritual is to create those secrets. I'm not defending Margaret
Yeah,
Thatcher or the
wow,
Billington
yeah.
Club, but I'm just saying that these rituals can have these kinds of functions of creating secrets.
I
And
see.
this fits really well with the non-disclosure norms of paganism, where you don't say what happens in rituals to people that weren't there. And if you have to give people a heads up, give them foreknowledge so that they can consent, well, you've upset the very norm of non-disclosure, because now the people will be like, okay, thanks for telling me, I'm not going to go to it. Off they go home, and now they know what's happened in the ritual because you've told them, and so you yourself have violated the very non-disclosure norm that people in pagan communities typically advocate for. Although we will come back to that. So you also have these other kinds. So that's one kind of function, the function of ritual of creating or transmitting or earning secret knowledge. Another is the rituals can be an experiential journey,
Mm.
transformative experience that you go on. So maybe a rite of passage marking before and after, like you've become a teenager and now you've gone through some ritual in the mountains, and that before and after stage and what happened on the way is like part of what it is to go through that transition. It was like an experiential journey in itself. And some of these experiences, not all, but some are less effective as transformative experiential journeys if you know what's going to happen. So to see why, imagine you're going into a haunted house, very popular in this country in America, into a haunted house. But before you're allowed into the haunted house, you have to consent to what will happen in the haunted house. So the greeter at the entryway tells you, okay, in this room, what's going to happen is the person's going to jump out on the left, and they're going to be wearing fangs, and they're going to be really close. And then somebody who is really high up, so they look tall, is going to come out on the right. And then you're going to hear rattling and booing sounds in the next room, and you're going to go through. if you're told that beforehand before you go into the haunted house, it's going to detract from the experience, to say the
Mm,
least. It's not going to be as effective as a haunted house scary experience. Same for things like immersive art journeys. Somebody set up an installation of immersive art. If you know what's going to happen, it's not going to be as effective. Movies, adventures and wild nights out, trips in the mountain, video games, conversations. If to participate in a conversation, you have to first consent to what's going to be talked about. Conversation can't have that same kind of influence on you. Mm. And so the goals of both the participant or the audience member, the person who's experiencing the haunted house or the artwork, and the creator, their goals, their values, they're both impeded by this consent norm. Of course, it doesn't apply to those things, and for good reason. It would. And so this is kind of the same for some rituals. Not all rituals, I should say. Like for some rituals, knowing what happens in advance does not affect it, or in fact even increases the function of the ritual. So a monk who ritualistically chants the same things, same mantras every day for hours every day, they know what's going to happen, and that's part of the meditative practice. Similarly, like Catholic Mass, Catholics know what's going to happen in the Catholic Mass. It's very predictable. It doesn't detract from the Catholic Mass because the Catholic Mass is about some other thing. It's not about like transformative journey of which requires surprise. I would argue that so somebody might be like, okay, but at least just give them a head, just tell them what won't happen. Just at least say you come with us on this, you can be in this erotically charged magic circle where there'll be some gyrating on the altar, but don't worry, that's all that's going to happen. They're not going to get any. They might enthusiastically gyrate, but they're not going to and then say what they're not going to do. But I think even that can dampen the experience. And to motivate why, I want to describe an experience I had way back, like 15 years ago, when I first moved to America. I went to Atlanta and I went to this immersive warehouse exhibition called Dialogue in the Dark. And the whole warehouse was taken over, and it was to create a simulacrum of being blind. So they recreated city streets, but without any lights whatsoever. And our group was led around by every group was led around by people who were blind. So we had to cross streets and then to shops and so on, without being able to see. It was phenomenal. It was really interesting. It was really, I kind of want to say illuminating and eye-opening, but I'm going to refrain. Like it
yeah,
was really,
yeah.
it was a transformative experience for me. It was really helped me with this kind of understanding that experience a little bit. I mean, not a ton, of course, but a little bit. But now there was
No,
something
that's
very unnerving about
interesting.
it because you couldn't relax. You didn't know what was going to happen. You didn't know where you were. It was very kind of. But now, suppose if you're crossing a road, suppose if beforehand they'd warned you at least of the boundary conditions. Don't worry, there's not going to be any loud noises to shock you. Like screeching on brakes, that kind of thing won't happen. It won't be nothing shocking. Just telling me that, well, I might be more comfortable walking around, less on edge. But that comfort comes at a cost. So it's going to be less impactful as an experience because I know that that kind of thing is not going to happen.
Less immersive, I suppose, in that respect. Because that's really interesting in terms
Hmm.
of like just the idea of and a sensory in terms of the deprivation. I remember um, I had a push bike accident and I came off the bike and I'd hit my head, so I was not really quite with it. And I'm still not sure if my eyes were open or not. But I remember laying on the street and I was aware that I was in the road and not so far as to be in the middle, but not so kind of close to the curb as perhaps I would like. And I remember being there and just hearing a vehicle coming towards me, and I laid there and I was like, I could be hit, and I don't know if I will be, and that kind of weird having to sort of accept it in the moment of that I just don't know, and that was a really just obviously quite a scary moment, but also really fascinating. Because I remember being in there and being like, "There's something coming." All my training has been in my life has been to tell me to get out of the way of that sound if I am in a place I shouldn't be, by the permitted crossing and all that kind of thing. So it's very interesting and almost kind of transgressive to just lay there because A, I couldn't move, but B, that sense of like, mentally I'm just going to have to absorb and experience this, and that was such a
Mm.
fascinating thing. And yeah, really, and sight loss is something I used to work at an optician's, and it's one of those things that we would do well to kind of consider more in terms of our environment. So that sounds like a vital exhibit actually, and a great
Yeah.
instance of how something experiential is important versus something informational.
Yeah, like the power of, right, the power of experience and how information can detract from it. Too much information or information of the
Mm.
wrong kind can detract from experiences. How things like being comfortable can dampen experiences in a way that takes away some of their force. Um, yeah, actually, I mentioned how the affirmative consent model stemmed from BDSM contexts. So it's probably worth also just noting here that a lot of the not all, but a lot of the BDSM aims, insofar as we can understand those as kind of rituals or actions with aims, are not impeded by foreknowledge. Things like pain and bonding and pleasure and affirming power hierarchy, whatever those aims are. And that's part of why this affirmative consent model has worked so well for the kind of pick up play in BDSM context, is because foreknowledge doesn't preclude those aims from coming out, from being met. Some BDSM aims are in tension with foreknowledge. So if you want like total power exchange relationships, or if you want a kind of primal play, then foreknowledge could like take away the idea that you have total power exchange or primal play occurring. But those are exactly the kinds of things that don't really suit pickup play in BDSM, party contexts.
Yeah.
And so it's not maybe some kinds of not consensual non-consent too, where the thought is the person's going to try to escape in a bunch of different ways.
Mm.
Mm. You don't know which ways, and you're going to block them, however, something like that. But that's exactly why the affirmative consent model is not working so well for the kind of total power exchange or the primal play type things, and that those things there, but therefore don't really suit pickup play in BDSM dungeon contexts. So it's really, and so I highlight that partly because it's again another illustration of the way that we need different norms, a variety of norms, a plurality of ethical models that we can then employ to better um, be responsive to the characteristic and the distinctive aims and needs and values of the different contexts. And just because something works really well for, say, BDSM pickup play in Ink Dungeons, does not mean that it's going to be the model that we should then use in something like Magic Circle with some gyrating happening in the middle at a campground. That's the not desirable part. And then I think it's not, so I've said like it's not necessary, not
Yeah.
desirable, but I also think it's not feasible, which
Mm.
is an even bolder claim. So, or at least it's a different claim. So probably bolder. So the not feasible is, so far we've looked at the perspective of the people in the participants in the magic circle and protecting them, thinking about their interests, their perspective, and that's important. But often overlooked are the event organizers, the community organizers, like the protagonists, the laborers, the workers, the people who are providing the infrastructure. Their perspective, norms, needs, and their humanity is often overlooked in these kinds of discourses, where people will sometimes be like, well, we need to have this, and we need to have this, and we need to have this, and we need to have this. And then it's like the host is like, I can't provide all that. So we have to also think about what's realistic, feasible, and desirable for those people and what those people are even aiming to do. One thing that pagan event organizers are aiming to do is often to transcend existing norms and to break free, to kind of emancipate from existing social forms and building new forms, making new things possible. In the same kind of way that, for example, burlesque organizers are, like changing what is possible, what is feasible, what is normal by violating existing norms or going kind of transcending them, going beyond them, and also not really knowing what's going to happen because it's experimental. So you can change social norms, you can sculpt society through very predictable rituals. So military parades, very scripted, very predictable, done many times before. Send some tanks, send some flags, send some foot soldiers, couple of horses, on the streets, blah, 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 done. There's no surprise, there's no experimentation there. And you can change society towards maybe a more hawkish one, more authoritarian one. Pagan communities are not usually much like military parades. They tend to be much more homespun, much more experimental, much more like a few people being like, hey, what'd be really nice is if our city had a Beltane. What would happen in Beltane? Should we like what would happen to Pagan? Let's do a Beltane. Speak to some people, do some research, and sort of homespin some experimental, exploratory, sort of co-created ritual. Those things people don't really often. It depends a lot. These things vary, but often the organizer doesn't really know what's going to happen. They That's kind of valuable too because they want the other participants to have some say. They want things to be an authentic unraveling, a co-created journey. They don't want to be the controlling choreographer who's got it all figured out. Some do, But some want it to be like we're co-creating this thing. Maybe the May Queen and the Oak King, when they're kind of embodying these spirits, they're going to be feel called to do a certain thing, and authentically they're going to do this thing, and these other things will emerge. And so the organizer, the facilitator has to go with the flow. So they need that kind of freedom to sort of vibe. They can't give detail as a result. They can't give detailed prior briefings about what will happen as is required for affirmative consent because they don't know what's going to happen, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing they don't know because that's what's going to happen is going to be co-created by the group. So, for example, to make that more concrete, if you're all in the magic circle and some of the people begin to gyrate their hips, they sort of gently in rhythm to the gyrating people on the altar. And then the facilitator might notice that, and that might just catch on organically, and everyone starts doing it. Or the facilitator might say, "I invite you to flow with your hips in rhythm to the gyrations," because half the people are already doing it and they're beginning to catch on. But if instead she had been like that hadn't started organically, and she'd been like, "Now gyrate your hips in rhythm," that could feel really clumsy and clunky and a bit like overbearing and a bit awkward. Like she had this vision and now she has to get us all to do it. But this idea that like things can go with the flow and then things happen and she can react to them, and it means that she can't give people these briefings because she doesn't know. And like I say, that's a good thing. And then similarly, the protagonists, so the two people in the middle, they also need their freedom because these people are not like hired actors that you can direct and choreograph. They're people who are sort of typically pagans going through this pretty intense ritual in front of people, mostly their friends. Maybe they're feeling a bit shy, maybe they're feeling like excited, an authentic experience for them. Or, like depending on your metaphysics, they've been embodied by the spirits of the divine. There might also be things like taking mushrooms as part of the ritual, for example. Um, these things can or these trance-like states can make it that it's not really a choreographable, predictable set of outcomes. Then there's going to be boundary conditions. Like if people start doing a certain thing, then one would be a kind of monitor and stop that. And if it's the kind of people, and that shows that you need to have good protagonists, well selected protagonists who aren't inclined to suddenly start pushing boundaries in a way that's bad. They suddenly start getting completely naked when that would be inappropriate in the context, for example. And then also, their the protagonists' boundaries are important with respect to their own ethics, their own kind of needs. So I have this. I was reading a book on an edited volume on pagan consent ethics, and there's Brandy Williams has a piece, and she's in the OTO, this big um, pagan organization, witchcraft organization. And she says that she kind of really realized that when she's the high priestess in her rituals at the front of the temple, she needs the power to see who's in the congregation, in the what she calls congregation, like the amassed people. So she calls them the congregation because they are. If it's a temple, they're the congregation. And she says she needs the power to decide whether to put her clothes back on or to remain nude at that time. And so now, when she choreographs those things for other people, and she's the facilitator or the organizer, sort of director, she makes sure that all the protagonists have that kind of power because they need it as individuals. So that's another kind of reason why it will be hard to know and predict in advance in a way that's required by the affirmative consent model. So I thought maybe one thing I could do is I could talk a little bit about why, because I think, especially in this country, in America, people are very nervous about anything, they really want to resist this. And I do talk about how, like, well, one thing, what about this other possibility where you list all the things that could possibly occur on the website as a kind of disclaimer? These things might happen. Would that solve the problem? Maybe we can come back to that, partly in the interest of time. But I'll just mention so I referred earlier to the pagan secrecy norm. That what happens in the ritual stays in the ritual, that you don't talk about it with people that weren't at the ritual. And so I think this itself is a really interesting norm. I mean, it has all kinds of value, it has all kinds of, it's understandable for all kinds of reasons. There's also maybe a potential refinement that could be valuable when we're thinking about things like ethics of ritual, ethics of social gatherings, and sex ethics in community contexts. So the norm is like no telling. If they weren't there, you can't describe it. But notice people want to innovate. A lot of people want to innovate. I mean, some people really want to actually like recreate ancient things, and that's innovative too by our current standards. To go back and that's innovative. But typically, people want to be innovative. They want to avoid harm, prevent harm, and they want to learn from each other. And notice you can't learn from each other with the secrecy norm in place. But the secrecy norm does have value. It has various values. It's there for a reason, or for reasons. Um, sort of. So there might be a kind of refinement that might at least help get some of those competing rival values. And that's that if things that happen at the ritual are either good or neutral, then the secrecy norm applies. You're no telling. You can't tell people what happened if it's good or neutral. But if it was a misstep, a moral mistake, a harm, sexual violation, then you can tell people. Then the secrecy norm doesn't apply to those things, to the mistakes, to the problems. And so, to give a kind of non-sexual example, suppose that the facilitator puts sort of high priestess puts a chemical on the flames and it turns the ritual flame blue. Could be the kind of thing where you don't tell other people that that happened, and if you know what chemical it was, you don't tell other people. So you're retaining that mystique, those secrets within your community. But if they put a hydrocarbon on the flame and it caused a forest fire, you can tell people that, and you
Yeah.
can be like, "Heads up! Don't put that one on on the ritual flame in the forest. Even if it does turn the flame blue, it also can set some of the forest ablaze. So don't do that." So that can be kind of good harm prevention, learning from error, and also potentially accountability, where if the thing that's
Mm.
happening is not a mistake of fire, but a mistake of sexual conduct. And the people who are kind of pushing boundaries or being inappropriate or exploiting their leadership positions, then there'll be accountability because no secrets do not govern those behaviors. So
Yeah.
that's the kind of potential refinement. And I think it's one that we intuitively, probably people already kind of operate with. It's probably the operationalized, like actual, and the sort of the manifest, the meaning actual, actually used, um, the operational secrecy norm. Now, notice there are still costs, right? You're not learning from each other. You're not being like, hey, this really cool thing happened. We could, I heard about this really cool thing in Alabama. We can try it in Mississippi. Mm. But that's at least a little refinement that might help at least the harm prevention, if not the kind of
Yeah, no,
benefit
it makes
spreading, be
sense
a good
to have
idea
that sort
spreading.
of. Yeah, and I think it emphasizes, the desire because it's such a unregulated and decentralized thing, an umbrella to exist underneath. When you're in these sort of group spaces, it emphasizes the responsibility that folks have, in that. Sure, it's great to have that close and that connection through honoring, like you say, what goes on in a circle stays in the circle. But like you say, those paradigms and those boundaries are, when it comes to something that is, like you say, the harm aspect of things, the thing that causes, and that harm could be to the person or as you say, the environment. I think it's that important thing that prevents secrecy being weaponized and abused. I think
Yeah.
that's the thing.
Yeah. Some thoughts about potential things that one might put. Well, yeah, I mean, so part of what's motivating the project, this kind of idea that we shouldn't just be taking the interpersonal sex norms of consent, say for example affirmative consent or some other consent, and then just using that to understand our erotic rituals, is I think it's really important to taking part of taking paganism and modern witchcraft, Wicca, and other countercultural gathering institutions and social forms seriously, taking them seriously as social forms, as institutions, as features of our culture, as parts of our social infrastructure. Do you want to take them seriously as parts of our social society, as something like religions or quasi religions or social institutions? Then we can't just use social interpersonal sex ethics like the kind that you use two people in a bedroom, because it doesn't apply. We can't just take those and apply them because it's a different kind of a thing. And there are instead we need to look to the social and political philosophy, like the ethics of clubs and institutions and politics and social groups, because that's much more what it is. And so partly it's this project, this broader project of taking paganism seriously as a social form, which is I've been doing in various different ways, like explaining it in various different ways and how to do this. And part of it is this idea of like we need to really think through the sex ethics of ritual as erotic ritual as social infrastructure. And that's why it isn't just two people alone in the bedroom, but there's actually more people watching or something like that. It's not like that. It's very distinctive. It's very interesting and fascinating and distinctive. So where they're holding space in a magic circle, they're not just watching. It's not like a Amsterdam sex theatre where you can get up and walk out.
Mm.
walk back in again if you want to later. It's like, oh, let's say no sex, don't want to see it, walk out, come back. It doesn't, it's different from that. I mean, we can talk a little bit more about how to hold agency, to have the sort of different kinds of ethical, sexual, ethical, erotic containers, but it's different from something like a strip club where you can just walk in and walk out. But it's also not as involved. You know, the people holding the space in the magic circle are also not as involved as the protagonists, and so don't need the kind of stringent conditions for touch, for like say touch, because they're not being touched. They're like yards away in the
Mm.
magic circle. So I can talk a little bit about some things that might help in a toolkit for thinking these
Yeah, no,
questions
that
through.
would be helpful. Yeah, I think
But I
it's
don't
yeah, it's
want
very
to.
interesting. No, so I'm just yeah, I think the way you conceptualize it is really intriguing, and I think also what's great about saying that, seeking to take, pagan practices, witchcraft practices seriously is by kind of coming at the thing that is most salacious to people, I think, and the wider sort of people about paganism is the kind of sense that it's far more perhaps embodied in the different ways that we embody things, and I think that's such a yeah, it's a great way to just kind of go, okay, well, if this is something that we know is a social norm within certain parts of witchcraft communities or occult communities, then fine, let's engage with it as that and work, you know, with that rather than trying to put it in a container that doesn't actually work, in that sort of yeah. So I like the idea of the
Mm,
movie. The movie is a great analogy. When you were saying about
mm.
that, yeah. So a toolkit would be really helpful to sort of yeah. Let's fish about in this kit, as we always.
Yeah. Because a lot of toolkits are quite neat and tidy, and you can sort of see everything lined up. That's not like this. It's more like a grab bag. More like a grab bag of
Yeah, bag.
like a satchel with lots of random things in it, and some of them might help some people some of the time. So one is just this like really small like little expression that I think can be really helpful for facilitators, which is invitation, not expectation.
Oh,
It's kind of short, it's elegant, it's an invitation, not an expectation. Doesn't fit every context, right? Like if I'm invigilating an exam for my students, I can't be like invitation, not expectation. Like, no, I expect you to write the exam script. You're going to get graded on it, but it can help in some contexts. Another thing is I've emphasized that we need things that aren't things like moral moves that aren't the consent move, but this is actually a consent move. But I think it's a really helpful, elegant one as well for event organizers. I do this quite a bit. You get everyone to close their eyes, and then you say, okay, so typically it'd be something like, we're all out for a walk together and I want to take a photo. But suppose we don't really know each other. I mean, actually a group of students or something like that. And I'll be like, okay, put your hand up if you do not consent to me taking a photo. I'm going to send it to the philosophy department website. And then depending, then nobody might put their hand, I might repeat it a couple of times. People know what I'm saying. They really process it. I might say, put your hand up if you do consent to me taking a photo, and it goes on the department website. You do it either way. It's really clear. Um, and uh, and then they can just privately veto. And so this will happen when I do a lot of orgasm education. I mentioned this last time. I didn't really get into describing it, but I do this orgasm advice circle, orgasm workshops. And so sometimes they'll spring up kind of organically. They're not officially an orgasm advice workshop, but they'll just start talking about it. And I'll say, like, oh, everyone close your eyes. Okay. Put your hands up if you do not want, suppose we're at a philosophy conference, so now we're colleagues. Put your hands up if you don't want us to be talking about sex right now. And then people can be essentially veto the conversation and be like, okay, someone's not cool with that. Let's not talk about that. We'll come back to it another time. That kind of thing. So that's like a really nice, elegant move. You get everyone to close their eyes
mm.
and they can put their hand up to
The closing
basically
eyes,
veto.
yeah, very clever because it. I was thinking, yeah, it took me a second to be like, oh, you can't see the other people, so you're not pressurized either way. So yeah, the closing of the eyes because then you are all able to, but the signal that you can see as the facilitator is very clever in terms of centering not only your power of being able to know where you're going to go next with things, but also your power of protection for the people in that environment as well. Very interesting, yeah.
Yeah, I've done it before with a kind of sort of massage gathering, countercultural gathering with respect to toplessness.
Oh,
Put your hands up if you're not okay if people go topless at this massage gathering, and then people can veto that. And then if somebody vetoes, then no one can go topless. Just like a really nice tool. So that's another kind of one. but I think more substantial. They're just two very small ones, a bit more substantial. So one is we talked a bit about last time about scaffolding exit conditions.
Mm.
So what I mean by that is this idea consent is all about getting into the, and this is very influenced by Paul Kukla's book that I mentioned, Sex Beyond Yes. A lot of consent discourse is about getting into the situation. But what about getting out of it? Is
Yeah.
the getting out of it, how costly does that feel? How available does that feel? How is that done? Is that a big deal if that happens? And I mentioned how talking about containers can be smoother de-escalations because you can de-escalate easily and rechange and reflip and you're still in the container. It's not some big change. Whereas in a scene, if you make a big change, you've broken the scene. The scene is stopped, and that's a great
And yeah, you're
reduction
calling cut.
safety thing.
Yeah.
But a container allows more flexibility in that way, so it can be more useful for certain kinds of exploratory behaviors. I've noticed people sometimes use the word scene to refer to all the sex they have. And I kind of want to be like, try the word container. You might find it more helpful. And so in the context of so last time we talked more about like everybody there is a participant, and this one we're talking about there's perhaps a magic circle or an audience or a congregation, and then there's protagonists. But really, not just having the exit conditions, but communicating them to really signal that it's okay to leave and to signal then the kind of what will happen. So this idea of like boundary forming is like if you blah blah, then I will blah blah. So you could be like, look, you can leave. It's totally fine. You're still going to get invited back next year, no problem. Now it might be that you might think reasonably with the leadership in your coven, like for the people that leave, you probably don't want them at your closed coven that you're going to do next month, where you're actually having sex together. Because as a community leader, um, maybe you don't really want to have to also manage people who might be more liable to be triggered, who aren't really used to those things yet. Maybe they should come back to a few more kind of less full-on sex stuff before they go to the full-on sex stuff. I'm slightly
Mm.
kind of trying to guess what happens in things. But yeah, that's the kind of idea. Like, it's okay to have. The point is, it's okay to have boundaries. In the paper, I engage with a witch leadership, somebody who's writing a blog, who says like nobody should be excluded from a ritual because they don't want to be touched. I explicitly disagree. I'm like, look, if a person doesn't want to be touched, it's okay for you to exclude them from their sex right, from your sex right.
Mm.
Because if you're getting together, like four women going to get together and have sex together, and then one other person who wants to turn up but they don't want to be touched, you can have them there, but you're within your rights to exclude them. Like you don't want to have someone there who's just
Yeah.
keeping at a distance, you know?
It's yeah, I think the thing is
Mm.
it's about recognizing access in a way, and it kind of speaks to sort of decolonizing mindset in terms of not having to take up space everywhere that you go, and the choosing of whether, I was with some friends and we were on about a conversation that was about the body and processes of the body, and it was and I was asking this person a question. This person was in the same space as us, and that person very kind of maturely was like, "Yeah, this isn't a question. This isn't a sort of topic I want to sort of be a part of." And so they removed themselves. And it was important to me to check in with them afterwards and say, "Oh, hey, I'm sorry that that conversation wasn't exactly something you were interested in." And they were like, "Look, I'm an adult. I can remove myself. I can choose to not take part in this." And that was really so kind of exemplative of how we, whilst we should expect a level of respect from others and appreciation of others in terms of our boundaries and our, our autonomy, there's also that accountability of the self, of going, okay, what are my limits? What am I happy with? And am I actually, especially in situations like that where it becomes a point of like, well, if that isn't something you're into, then why are you seeking that space? And I think it comes back to the sort of the big goal of most of occultism, which is to know thyself, and the whole idea of perhaps knowing ourselves in these different ways, not just, the term shadow work gets thrown about so much within modern occultism. But I think sometimes we have to kind of get out of our heads and into our bodies. But part of the reason some people go to paganism is because of that, but part of it is as an alternative to other things. And I think we forget that there are elements to the living of ourselves and the reaction, the kind of alchemy of reaction. Something is creating a reaction in you, and you can alchemize that, or you could potentially let it, completely sort of explode, or try and tamp it down. I think there's choices to be made, and I think that sort of speaks to your point about those spaces of, and also being like, okay, this is this, and so doing
Yeah.
it.
So like one kind of in a slogan, it's like just because you're uncomfortable doesn't mean that they did something wrong. But it also
Yeah,
doesn't mean that you did something wrong. It could just be a mismatch. So like it could be okay if you're if you're uncomfortable with even like seeing someone breastfeeding. Doesn't mean they did something wrong, doesn't mean that you did something wrong. It can just be okay that you're uncomfortable. And it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's also okay to leave and avoid those spaces. And it's like, but it's not okay to assume that somebody else is doing something wrong just because you're uncomfortable. And then also to recognize that, you might go on a journey where you're uncomfortable with things now, but maybe through being uncomfortable, you become comfortable with things later, and there might be value in that. But also, you could just
yeah,
not go on that journey, and that's also totally fine. And then, as part of this, maybe like a little footnote or something, it's like your journey shouldn't be somebody else's burden. And this relates to this idea of like, just because there's a space doesn't mean that you should be in it. Is like, if it's not, if you're not ready for that space, just, it doesn't mean that you can just not be in that space. You don't have to like make different things difficult for the other people to. I mean, accommodation is tricky, right? Because like access is really important. So if it's to do with something like wheelchair access, right, you want that at the pagan festivals. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about things like whether it's different levels of erotic ritual. It's okay that that space isn't a good one for you. This space isn't a good one for you. This one, and then the other people want to do this stuff, and it's okay. That actually relates to another thing in this grab bag of the toolbox, which is this kind of abundance frame of mind, which I think came up in part two of our series as well, which is like, look, it's abundance, like abundance. There'll be other events, there'll be other opportunities. If you walk away from this magic circle, or if you walk away from this particular coven, it's okay. If you don't go back to that particular ritual, it's okay. And even if there aren't other such gatherings and communities in your area, which unfortunately could well be the case depending on where you are, because this isn't like Christianity where there's churches of different denominations everywhere. I mean, as it happens here in New Orleans, there's all kinds of pagan groups, but in a lot of other places that there aren't. And it's going to be okay because you have everything you need within you. And that's part of the abundance framework. Now, the abundance framework has limits, right? Because if you're hungry and you're homeless and then you have needs,
yeah,
you can die of lack of medical stuff, right? So I'm not saying like abundance, it's like is the panacea for every woe. But I'm saying for something like if it's spiritual fulfillment, and this is kind of where I was ending last time, like if it's to do with your sexual spiritual life, don't be putting pressure on other people to sort of perform certain roles because you need them. You don't like that's a really bad frame of mind to go into a kind of sexual erotic ritual even with yourself with. like and similarly with any kind of spiritual community, it's like you have enough within you. You don't need to remain in this situation that makes you uncomfortable. You don't need to, you'll be okay without it. And that's something in the toolkit. And then the final thing in the very bottom of this grab bag of random thoughts that could help in different ways is for the facilitators is this idea of, like I mentioned earlier, like think of yourself as a monitor, not a choreographer. So it depends on the ritual, depends on the person for sure. This idea of like you're a monitor, you can step in if it's needed. If things are going wrong, you can step in, but otherwise just let things take their course, let things um, sort of evolve. And then part of that is trusting yourself to be able to lead without controlling it. So it's kind of like teaching where you just let the classroom kind of go with the flow, but you trust yourself to step in if needed. And it's a different kind of trust from like you're going to like steer every move, like really going to be in control of it. So I was talking to a professor who said like she wouldn't teach abortion because she didn't trust the students to not say inappropriate things. Sort of suggested that maybe a different frame of thinking about this is that what if she can trust herself to make it okay?
yeah.
That even if a
Wow.
student does say the wrong thing, she'll be okay. She can say something next. That's much hard. That's much more demanding, right? That's like repairing a problem. And maybe that trust would be misplaced. Maybe sometimes some students say something and it actually can't be healed or you can't heal it. But this is this kind of idea that for at least some people, for some of the time, like you can kind of let go of control a bit, act as a monitor, you like really trust yourself to be a leader in this kind of from a less controlling position. So less of a choreographer. So that's the kind of It was like a bit of a pep talk at the end um,
Yeah, no.
for for event organizers. But that's like I say. I mean, I toolkit is overselling it. That was just some like eclectic thoughts where maybe something kind of seeds something in someone's mind as they're thinking through these topics.
Yeah, no, it's so no on the books. I think, yeah, it's such a great. If that was, if you don't want to call it a toolkit, I think it still feels to me like the some really helpful. It feels like you've got a tape measure in there, you've got the hammer, you've got you've got the screwdrivers of different kinds. I feel like it's pretty effective for what you need to get done.
Mm.
Even if it hasn't got the sort of strange, 8 mil of this or whatever it might be, it's still got a lot of validity in terms of helpfulness and yeah, and with event organising, which in itself, for sort of events in general, are such a challenge having co-organised or run different ones in the past, and even just being in proximity to organisers of other events, it's quite clear how much there goes into these things, and having tools like that is really helpful, and just yeah, it just helps to make the community stronger. I think yeah, just a really great deep dive. I think in this allows us to approach this topic with the kind of time it deserves. And I think that is really, yeah, been so helpful, especially over these three particular periods, but this one today especially. And I think that I'm still not over the movie thing because it just makes so much sense because of the fact that, I hate spoilers so much, right? But there is, there's, it's not like when you go to a movie, the reason why we have certain ratings, at least in the UK, the ratings of U or 12 or PG or 18 or R, those are essentially what you're saying are these permissive norms that occur that this kind of can sit within. And so they make the consent model kind of, as you sort of like you say, a sort of bold claim of the is it necessary in that scenario when there is already this structure that gives the sense of it's not consenting to every scene in the movie, but the movie may have these themes. I think it's just, and also like you say with the aspect of who gets to have the more of the focus on the conversations around what's happening. The actors have a very different understanding of scenes than the audience, and rightly so because there is a different requirement there. So yeah, I find that really interesting. When I have those initial barriers being like, oh, we can't criticize consent because surely that's only a good thing. I think to myself, well, in a movie, I don't consent to every scene. I consent to the kind of, it looks pretty good, looks like it's my kind of theme. It's this kind of age range, okay, I'm expecting this kind of potentiality. So, okay, I'm going to enter into this. And if I want to leave the theatre, I can leave the theatre. Like you say, by the fact that there is an exit there that's inbuilt, and that's an important point for rituals. And I think, in rituals in general, we sometimes suffer when you don't have the benefit of experience or with the benefit of a group which has perhaps been established over many years or whatever it might be, of the managing of the structure of a ritual. We can often be very intrinsic in terms of, or instrumental in terms of, like, I want this thing to come out of it, but not think about where and when things have to happen. Like you say, the flow of the container, and I think the ending of things can be a part where folks sort of fall down. They go, okay, I know I want to start it this way, but how do I actually, finish this off? So yeah, honestly, just yeah, juicy goodness from your philosophical self. Just absolutely, yeah, fascinating and something that will hopefully really, yeah, get people's minds ticking along on this.
It's funny. I think the movie, yeah, you mentioned the movie analogy, and I think that's a really nice one because, first of all, like, yeah, it's like the affirmative consent is definitely not what's going on with respect to details, right? Like, you're not affirmatively consenting to see them. There's this like tacit where you're remaining in the seat, and if
Mm,
it's looking like it's going to be a bit psychological thriller, a little bit sexy, you're remaining in the seat. And then there's this question about like if something suddenly happens that's really gnarly, then
mm,
it's like, well, if you went to a thriller, then maybe you kind of consented to a sudden gnarly thing happening. But if you went to a family comedy, then actually maybe there's something kind of like not cool about suddenly
yeah,
some horrible, genuinely graphic, decapitation of a child. Like I really want to say
Mm.
it in a family comedy. Like you, that's not okay. And there might also be something to learn here. Like I often emphasize the way the mainstream can learn from the counterculture. And
Mm.
maybe here the counterculture can learn from the mainstream. Is like presumably film directors, one thing that they might do is slowly potentially amp up something. So like going back
Mm.
to the erotic, going back to any kind of ritual, if you suddenly do a thing that might be worse than kind of foreshadowing that something will happen
Yeah.
and leading up to it, where you're giving people a bit of a chance to be like preparing themselves, being like, I'm not sure if I really want to be in this space. If you do want to do something like I'm a bit squeamish, but like like drawing blood.
Mhm.
Like I think probably you'd probably want to be just telling people beforehand that that's going to happen. But you could also intimate it in certain ways and like build up to it in certain ways, and like that you're slowly like
Yeah, the
creating
foreshadowing
the
can.
conditions where people can predict it, so that they can sort of close their eyes or something like that. In the same way that maybe that would be better in a film context.
Yeah, the direction thing, the directing it, I think is well, we know that some movies are have better direction than others and have better yeah, like you say, things like foreshadowing and things like building tension in a a way that is exciting and thrilling and all that kind of thing and feels a little bit of a I think a good ritual makes you feel a crackle in the air a little bit, and I think that is yeah, I think that's what we sort of aim for here. And I think this all speaks to just good planning of what you're, or good understanding of what you're wanting from the thing, good planning for what you can plan for, and acknowledging the bits that are going to be more spontaneous and are going to be more, you know, dependent on the sort of flow of energy at the time and the appropriateness of the, particular season or whatever it might be. But yeah, it's a lot to, and again, I think it's just emphasise the responsibility because we're talking specifically today about the kind of group aspect of it. Just that responsibility of entering into this in a way that is playful and respectful and all those things. Yeah, wow.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's to keep talking. I have this kind of slightly strange and almost feels like a bit of a side note to end on, or a tangent to end on.
Go
This is
for
not
it.
about sex at all, or at least I'm not understanding it that way. Other people could take it however they want, but like to really kind of encourage people to lean into these ideas of invitation, not expectation, not telling you what to do, to lean into these ideas of like creativity and kind of whether you're by yourself
Mm,
or in a kind of community, in a kind of cooperative community, the creativity of creating meaning through things like ritual or through shrines and altars or through even things like hand gestures. So I was doing a kind of Zoom workout with my bestie yesterday, and I just sort of mentioned to her that I've been doing this around the house, which is American Sign Language for I love you, and she speaks American Sign Language. Well, she knows she does American Sign Language, but not speak it. She communicates in American Sign Language. And I told her that I've been doing it around the house to remind me of her. And it's just like such a little, like, it's just a little
mm,
hand gesture. And I walk along and I do this, and it reminds me of my bestie. And I really maybe just sort of remind people that they have freedom to create that kind of meaning and create that kind of significance out of the mundane, out of a space can become an altar, an object, um, can become of significance. You're allowed to. And maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, because if I'm saying this to ordinary people, we're like, you're allowed to carry a rock in your pocket and have it as your special rock. Like
yeah.
you're allowed to do that. Rituals, it can be anything to kind of create that meaning and value in your life. I don't know. I just felt called to say that.
No, that's it. It's perfect, and it's so true. I think the whole point of this channel and the name of the channel was "Do the Magical Thing," and embracing that doing and trying to get past those sort of barriers, social or otherwise, that we have to the experience of things, because that's where the joy of magic and witchcraft has been for me, is in those moments where you've taken the risk, you've taken what I call the fool's leap, right? You are falling, you're taking the leap that the fool does, in terms of there's the cliff and you've gone, I'm not just going to stand on the edge of the cliff, but I am going over the edge, and like, why not see what happens? And then when you've taken that sort of leap, then it's what if you don't descend? What if you do? Like, but it's the embracing of that experience and then coming out of it, and those wonderful moments when a spell works, and you're like, oh shit, I did that. Like, okay, cool. And I think just embracing it and yeah, it's the joy of creation. The joy of creation is something that we all hold within us, and I think is something that is very, if not sacred, then intrinsic to ourselves. And I think creation itself wants to be realized. So yeah, I love a bit of creative force. Oh, well, this has been a tour de force of all our 3 sessions on this, the deep dives in the philosophy, the ethics, on something that I think is so easily sensationalized and so easily dismissed. Um, yeah, what a joy and what an absolute pleasure to have you here for these 3 sessions. Where can people find you? What are you up to next? What's going on? Tell me.
Well, so maybe the main 2 places. So my website is georgigardiner.com. Georgie is Georgi, and Gardiner is Gardiner. Just to Google me, it should come up. Um, it's a bit of a labyrinth. There is so much on that website. There's a whole
Yeah,
page on tarot.
fantastic.
There's a page on love. There's a page on the occult. There's all sorts. There's a page on innovative ways to gather and philosophical art. It's a huge website. There's a media page with all my podcasts and public writing, podcast interviews. So that's one place. And another place is on Facebook. If you follow me on Facebook, it's very eclectic. It's like thoughts, experimental ideas, sort of having this kind of discourse. People sort of go there to talk about philosophy and sex and tarot and art and so on. It's this kind of gathering space of people that talk about ideas on my Facebook page, and whatever's coming up, social norms for intercultural people. And to post a lot there, circus and fitness as well. And they're the main 2 places. And then like I say, on the media page of the website, there's a bunch of stuff. And then for that particular essay, the one that we've talked about today is called, I think it's going to be published under In Defense of Ritual Erotics Without Consent, Pagan Sex Ethics and the Costs of Knowing What is Coming, in the
Mm.
philosophy journal Hypatia. And then the other one that I've been talking about is Sex Witchcraft, Sex is so good, it can improve the rest of your life and philosophy can help. Of juicy ideas in there. And then, and that's in an edited volume on the philosophy of sexual violence, but you can just find the essay on my website. And that edited volume also has a short story on witchcraft. It has the Ace of Wands tarot card. That's the
Mm.
magic wand vibrator that came up in from Siren Santina, that came up last time, and then a whole bunch of other really interesting essays about sex ethics.
Yeah.
And I'm the editor of that volume.
Ugh, just great. Just honestly, so great. And just yeah, having been in both those spaces, both the website and your Facebook, I always think it's so. I think you just have such an excellent use of space, and just I've never seen an academic website like it. Because it's just so full of. Well, it feels like almost like a little entryway into the public version of your brain in a way. It's this wonderful, just all of these different essays, and I know that a lot of folks will appreciate the tarot side of things, but loads of things to think about. I think witches, are at their best when they're thinking about the world and how it is, how they exist within it and exist as a part of it. In exchange of it, so yeah, and just yeah, there's some really. What's so lovely is in the sea of detritus that is Facebook, having your post come up and being like, "Oh, I've got to think about this," or "Oh, that's really, yeah," and the way that you share things so personally, and you're not afraid to kind of go, "Woof, let's fish about in all this and find out what's going on." It's just yeah, brilliant. So yeah, everyone should check those out, and yeah, just thank you again so much for your time and all your brilliant knowledge here.
But yeah, thanks again, Lee. It's such an honor and a privilege and such a wonderful opportunity. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, fantastic.